Good morning. Welcome to the last day of the summer meeting. We're going to start off with the Spiny Dogfish Management Board meeting for August 3rd. My name is Nicola Meserve with Massachusetts. I'm joined up front by James Boyle, our species coordinator, and also virtually we have Cynthia Ferrio from NOAA who will be helping us with one of our agenda items today. We have a quick meeting. So you have your agenda before you. Are there any changes to the agenda today? Any opposition to approving the agenda? If not, we'll consider that approved by consent. We have proceedings from our last meeting in February of 2023. Are there any modifications to the proceedings? Seeing none, we'll also consider those approved by consent and move on to public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda today. Are there any hands for public comment? None in the room and none online either. So we can move on to a update on the Council's joint action on the monkfish and dogfish fisheries to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch. The board is tracking this joint action with the understanding that the Dogfish Board may be looking to make some complementary action once the councils have gotten further down the road in their development of this action. So we'll look to Cynthia to provide that update.
All right, thank you. So just a brief background on this action first. Both the New England and Mid-Atlantic councils are cooperatively developing a joint framework to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in federal large mesh gillnet fisheries. And this is in a response to the requirements of the 2021 biological opinion for sturgeon. And these requirements in general laid out by the BIOP are to reduce or minimize the impacts of incidental take in large mesh gillnet fisheries, and large mesh in the BIOP is defined as mesh size greater than 7 inches, but then without major disruption to the operations of these fisheries. And for this action, monkfish and spiny dogfish were identified as the two primary fisheries of focus, primarily because they were managed by both councils and they had the highest number of sturgeon interactions with gillnet gear in the recent, I think, 5 to 10 years. Although throughout this development process, there have been some discussion with respect to dogfish about whether or not to include measures to also reduce interactions with smaller mesh sizes, such as 5 to 7 inches, because that's where most of the dogfish gillnet fishery is prosecuted with less than 7 inches, and also where many of the interactions have taken place with sturgeon. Excuse me. So in May this year, a joint committee of the monkfish and dogfish committees from both councils recommended potential alternative measures to reduce sturgeon bycatch in both fisheries. And I'll speak primarily for the dogfish because this is the Dogfish Board. These measures were really with seasonal restricted gear areas to focus on the hotspot interactions with sturgeon, and limited soak times from ranging from 24 to 72 hours, but mostly 48 to 72 hours. And the committee also did recommend including alternatives for those smaller mesh sizes, so not just greater than 7-inch mesh sizes. And then in their respective June meetings, both councils, Mid-Atlantic and New England, reviewed these alternatives presented by the committees. And both councils did note that before approving any alternatives, they wanted to meet with law enforcement committees to discuss the enforceability of these possible alternatives and the feasibility, the realistic possibility of things such as soak time restrictions, and if that would be possible or worth pursuing. And we actually do have a meeting scheduled for early September to develop this further. In terms of the two council meetings, the Mid-Atlantic recommended continued development of these alternatives, both the restricted gear areas and soak times, and did recommend looking at both 5 to 7 inches and greater than 7 inches, but not final approval, just continued development pending the discussion with law enforcement. And the New England Council approved the full range of monkfish alternatives, but held off on making any firm decisions for spiny dogfish until, again, after the meeting with law enforcement. So we're holding off on any final decisions. We also announced in June that new bycatch estimates for Atlantic sturgeon in the gillnet fishery for the recent 5-year period has been exceeded, or has exceeded the allowed levels under the Endangered Species Act, which will likely trigger the reinitiation of the 2021 biological opinion, which has initiated this action. So that said, the timelines are still being worked out and reinitiation has not happened yet. So we are still held to those requirements of the original 2021 biological opinion. So we still need to follow through with this framework action, and everything is still proceeding as planned. The only change in the timeline here would be that the councils have decided that rather than taking final action on this in December as originally planned, we're going to maybe extend that and push final action to spring 2024, maybe April, to better align with any new information coming from the reinitiation process and help guide and inform development of any measures to help restrict and see what comes out of the reinitiation for the buyout. And just a final note, as we're going through this, everything I'm talking about with this framework is for federal waters. It's a council action, but with dogfish specifically, a majority of the interactions with sturgeon have occurred in state waters. And so I think it's really important. There have been folks obviously from the states at these meetings, at the committees, but if the commission were to take a complementary cooperative action in federal waters with this, it might be really beneficial just because it only does so much if we're doing federal waters versus state waters. And so I think it would be worth the board and commission to evaluate and look and see if we want to take a cooperative action specifically for dogfish. And that's pretty much my update. I can take questions.
Thank you, Cynthia. Are there any questions for Cynthia about this joint action? Yes, John Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I might have missed it, but what was the biop allowance of sturgeon catch and how many were caught in the dogfish fishery?
Can you provide those details for us, Cynthia?
I don't have hard numbers. I can look it up. Yeah, I can give it. I don't have the hard numbers in front of me. I know that. Yeah, I don't have the hard numbers, but I can look it up. I know dogfish was second highest in volume, but I don't have the numbers for or what the ITS was specifically.
All right, we can follow up with specific numbers though, John. Are there any other questions? So it sounds to me as though the board will be discussing in May at our spring meeting the potential for complementary action if the final action does occur at the council's April meeting. So more to come. Okay. And we will move on next to the FMP review and state compliance for the 2021-2022 fishing year. And James is going to give us that presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. I will pretty quickly go through the spiny dogfish FMP review and state compliance for the 2021 to 2022 fishing year. So just a quick overview. I'll start with a reminder of the status of the stock based on the 2018 stock assessment update. And then I'll discuss the fishery and wrap up with the state compliance, de minimis requests, and PRT recommendations. So the latest stock status information for management use still comes from the 2018 stock assessment update. The female spawning stock biomass was estimated to be over 106,000 metric tons in 2018, which was above the threshold of 79,644 metric tons. In 2017, fishing mortality on exploitable females was estimated to be 0.202 and has remained below the threshold level of 0.244 since 2005. A research track assessment was recently completed at the end of 2022, and a management track assessment is scheduled to be peer reviewed in September of this year. In terms of the commercial quota and landings, the fishing year ran from May 1st of 2021 to April 30th of 2022. The quota was 29.56 million pounds. The trip limit was 6,000 pounds for the northern region states, and commercial landings in total were approximately 9.87 million pounds. This is about a 23% decrease from the fishing year of 2020 to 2021. Recreational harvest and dead discards, which were reported by calendar year rather than fishing year, both increased. Harvest was approximately 471,864 pounds in 2021, which is about a 79% increase from 2020. The dead discards were estimated to be about 2.6 million pounds, which is a 52% increase from 2020. All regions and states harvested within their quota, and all states implemented regulations consistent with the requirements of the FMP, with one minor note that I'll get into in the PRT recommendations. Under the Spiny Dogfish FMP, a state qualifies for de minimis status upon request if its landings are less than 1% of the coastwide landings. New York and Delaware have both requested de minimis status, and Delaware qualified by harvesting less than 1%, whereas New York harvested just over with 1.14% of the total landings. So there are a few PRT recommendations. The first is that while every state did satisfy the weekly reporting requirements through either SAFIS or NOAA fisheries, some states did not provide their reporting regulations that show that requirement, and the PRT just requests those going forward. The PRT also noted a concern that Connecticut's regulations are not consistent with the finning prohibition required under Addendum 5. Specifically, Addendum 5 states that, quote, removing any fin of spiny dogfish at sea is prohibited, including the tail, end quote, and all spiny dogfish must be landed with fins naturally attached to the corresponding carcass. However, Connecticut's wording is the possession of spiny dogfish fins in the absence of the fish from which removed is prohibited. So the PRT believes that this language is inconsistent and allows the fins to be detached at sea as long as the body of the fish is also maintained in possession. I have spoken with Connecticut about this issue, and they're planning on amending their regulations accordingly in the fall to be implemented during the current fishing year. Furthermore, the PRT notes that the FMP gives a fairly loosely defined definition of biomedical supply for exempted fishing permits, and the states are reporting harvest under a variety of research and education purposes. While the reported harvests under these permits are well below the 1,000 fish limit, the PRT may require board input on what types of harvest count towards this limit in the future should any state start to near that limit. And finally, the PRT recommends the board consider the purpose of the de minimis provisions as they're currently written, given that all states must satisfy the only monitoring requirement to report annual landings regardless of de minimis status. With that, the board action to consider today is the approval of the FMP review and state compliance for the 2021-2022 fishing year, as well as the de minimis requests for both New York and Delaware. And with that, I'll happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Are there questions? I guess I have one that I'd start with. New York's landings in a single year are not within the de minimis percentage, but if you looked at the 3-year average, would they fall? The board may remember that there's new guidelines on de minimis that are expected to be adopted into FMPs in the future that establish using a 3-year average as the basis.
Thank you. Yes, if we were going by a 3-year average as stated by the Commission's de minimis policy, they would qualify.
So I think that's something we could consider in New York's request for de minimis. Are there any questions? Sounds like Connecticut is aware of the issue with the finning and can take care of that in a timely manner.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, that was just an oversight in our regulation language, and thankfully we have declaration authority to do anything that's an FMP mandate, so that's a really simple process, and we'll correct it pretty quick.
Great, thank you for that, Justin. Any questions, Mike Luisi?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No questions. I can make a motion if you'd prefer. I don't know if staff prepared one.
Yes, just one moment. We'll get that up. Go ahead, please.
Okay, the motion: move to approve the fishery management plan review, state compliance reports, and de minimis request for New York, Delaware, and New York for the 2021 through 2022 fishing year.
Is there a second to that? Ray Kane? Any board discussion on this motion? Seeing none, is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, we will consider that approved unanimously. And that brings us to any other business. Is there any other business to come before the board today? No? If not, you've done a lovely job staying on track here. And we will take a motion to adjourn. So moved. All right. Thank you. And we will stick with Tony. You want to give an update on the timing for the next board meeting?
We'll start 5 minutes early and start at 9:10.